The moment I heard that sharp adhesive snap echo across my driveway, I knew something was wrong. I turned and saw HOA Karen pressing a bright orange violation tag onto the hull of my Navy patrol boat, her hand firm, her expression satisfied, completely unaware she was marking federal military property with a confidence she had absolutely no right to hold. Subscribe. Before I tell you how that single act triggered a federal-level confrontation, stay with me till the end. The patrol boat had been in my driveway for only a few days, but it already felt like part of my routine. Each morning, I stepped outside into the cool coastal air, the smell of salt water drifting up from the inlet 2 streets away, and checked the equipment exactly the way my orders required. The boat rested on a steel trailer, its hull reflecting the soft morning light in a way no civilian vessel ever could. The raised lettering, U.S. Navy property, stood bold and unmistakable. Anyone with even the slightest sense of awareness would understand immediately that this wasn't something governed by neighborhood opinions. I had full authorization from my command to keep the craft at home while I completed maintenance and system diagnostics. The inlet nearby was perfect for short test runs, and working from home saved travel time back and forth from the base. Everything was documented, approved, and logged. Even my neighbors seemed intrigued at first. Some admired the boat from a distance, others slowed their morning walks just to get a better look. But intrigue changed into unease the moment HOA leadership realized a military asset was sitting in their neighborhood, something beyond their control, beyond their checklists, and beyond their comfort zone. That morning began like all the others, quiet, still, touched by the distant sound of waves hitting the breakwall. I knelt beside the hull, tools in hand, checking the wiring harness for corrosion. The cool air carried the metallic scent of engine housing mixed with a faint tang of sea salt. The neighborhood felt calm, but beneath that calmness, a tension was creeping in, one I didn't recognize until I heard the footsteps. Slow, sharp, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who didn't come to ask questions, but to enforce decisions they had already made in their mind. I stood slowly, already knowing who it would be. HOA President, Clipboard Queen, self-appointed guardian of community standards. The woman everyone privately referred to as Karen, not because of her name, but because her behavior embodied the stereotype with such accuracy it felt like parody. She walked right up to the boat, her eyes full of scrutiny, scanning the hull as if evaluating a threat rather than a military vessel. She didn't look at me. She didn't ask anything. She simply inspected the craft with the entitlement of someone who sincerely believed she had the authority to regulate anything she saw. Her eyes passed directly over the federal seal, the serial plate, the raised lettering, and even the classification markings. Anyone else would pause, hesitate, or at least acknowledge the obvious. But Karen wasn't anyone else. To her, everything within eyesight fell under HOA jurisdiction. And so, she did what she always did when encountering something she didn't understand. She categorized it as a violation. Before I could step forward, she flipped open her clipboard, revealing the bright orange violation tags she distributed like a sheriff handing out citations in a town where only she believed danger existed. I opened my mouth to explain, calmly and respectfully, that the patrol boat was federal military property, here under official authorization, exempt from HOA policies. But she didn't pause to listen. She didn't even glance my way. Her entire posture communicated a single message: I make the rules here. She peeled the backing off the violation sticker with a practiced flick of her wrist. I stepped closer, repeating myself more firmly, but she was locked inside her own certainty. With absolute confidence, and absolutely no legal authority, she pressed the bright orange tag onto the hull. The sound was sharp and final, the adhesive snapping against the cold metal like a trigger being pulled. A smear of glue spread beneath her hand. The orange paper looked disturbingly loud against the navy gray. I froze, stunned not by fear, but by the sheer absurdity and disrespect of what she had just done. Civilian interference with federal property isn't a small matter. It isn't a misunderstanding. It's a legal issue with real consequences. But Karen acted as though she had just corrected a neighborhood nuisance, something trivial, something beneath serious consideration, something she believed she could control. She stepped back, admired her own work, and scribbled a note on her clipboard without once acknowledging the seriousness of what she had done. The breeze lifted the edges of the violation tag slightly, releasing a faint chemical smell from the adhesive. The moment felt unreal. The boat, normally a symbol of discipline and precision, now carried a cheap paper sticker, one that didn't belong anywhere near federal equipment. The disrespect wasn't personal. It was systemic. She wasn't targeting me. She was protecting her illusion of authority, an illusion so strong she couldn't see the boundaries she had just crossed. Finally, she closed her clipboard, turned on her heel, and walked away as though she had just resolved a major safety concern. Her stride was quicker, lighter, triumphant. She didn't ask questions, didn't wait for answers, didn't consider legal implications. To her, the matter was settled the moment the sticker touched steel. But as I watched her leave, a heaviness settled in my chest. This wasn't over. She had acted under the assumption that HOA rules overpowered everything else. What she didn't know, and what she would soon learn, was that federal law didn't bend for neighborhood politics. I took a slow breath and approached the hull, running my fingers along the violation tag. The paper crinkled under my touch, its texture rough and offensive against the smooth metal surface. The wind carried the scent of ocean spray and adhesive fumes, blending into a single sharp reminder of the conflict now unfolding. I looked at the empty street, the boat, and the glowing orange sticker, and realized this moment wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the beginning of a confrontation she had triggered without understanding its scale. And it would change the atmosphere of our entire neighborhood. The morning after the violation tag incident felt heavier, as if the air itself carried the weight of something unresolved. When I stepped outside with my coffee in hand, the first thing I saw was the bright orange sticker still clinging stubbornly to the hull, its bold print almost glowing in the early sunlight. The adhesive smell lingered in the cool morning air, mixing with the salt carried from the inlet. Even though nothing had happened overnight, the entire driveway felt different, tenser, charged with an invisible current that told me this situation was far from settling down. I approached the boat slowly, more out of disbelief than caution. The fact that a civilian had walked up and tagged a federal naval asset still didn't seem real. In the Navy, we sign chains of custody, log serial numbers, and document every transfer. Nothing is touched casually. Everything has protocol. But here, in a quiet civilian neighborhood, a volunteer HOA president had ignored all of that structure and slapped her authority onto something she had no jurisdiction over. The sticker wasn't just paper on steel, it was a reminder of how far ignorance and entitlement could stretch. As I circled the hull, I noticed a fresh envelope on my welcome mat. It hadn't been there when I woke up, which meant someone had come by early. The HOA letterhead practically shouted at me before I even picked it up. Inside was a second notice, written in firmer, almost aggressive language. They referenced neighborhood standards, unsafe storage of large vehicles, and mandatory compliance. The final lines mentioned potential fines and, shockingly, possible towing. The idea that they could tow a Navy patrol boat out of my driveway was so absurd it bordered on surreal, yet they wrote it confidently. I took the letter inside and laid it next to my military authorization packet on the kitchen table. The contrast was jarring, official government documents stamped, signed, and filed in proper order, and a neighborhood committee letter filled with assumptions and misplaced authority. I read both carefully, then read them again, and the difference in legitimacy was almost laughable. But the problem wasn't which set of papers held the real power. The problem was that the HOA believed theirs did. And belief, especially in the hands of someone like Karen, could escalate things quickly. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a notification. The HOA had sent out a community-wide email blast. They didn't mention my name, but the message was unmistakably about me. It warned residents of unauthorized large watercraft creating aesthetic disruption and claimed that such items introduced potential safety hazards. People started glancing at my driveway differently, some curious, others uneasy, a few clearly influenced by the HOA's tone. It was subtle social pressure, but it was pressure nonetheless. The kind designed to isolate the one resident who didn't immediately bend to HOA expectations. I decided to take action the right way. I drafted a calm, detailed email to the HOA board explaining everything clearly. The federal nature of the vessel, the authorization I held, the exemption clauses that protected military equipment from civilian regulation, and the legal boundaries they were crossing. I attached digital copies of my orders and invited them to reach out to the base's legal office for verification. I even offered to meet in person to clarify anything they didn't understand. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about preventing chaos from growing out of something simple. But hours passed with no response. Instead, something much worse appeared on the community notice board later that afternoon. A printed schedule listing dates for Parking and Property Compliance Sweep. Below that, in smaller but unmistakable text, were the words, "A private towing service has been contracted to assist with non-compliant units." And next to the schedule was a list of targeted streets, mine included. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just Karen acting alone. The HOA had mobilized the entire board to enforce a decision they believed was righteous, even though they were legally powerless. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the sky shifted into muted orange tones, I taped a laminated copy of my authorization orders directly onto the hull beside the violation tag. The wind tugged lightly at the edges, but the bold, printed words remained visible. If the HOA truly intended to escalate this, I wanted it to be absolutely clear that any interference would be intentional, not accidental. As I stepped back from the boat, I noticed the neighborhood was unusually quiet. Fences, curtains, and windows carried a different energy, as if people sensed a storm forming. Later, checking my driveway camera feed, I noticed a black SUV parked near the end of the street. Engine off. Windows dark. No one stepping out. It wasn't a car I recognized from the neighborhood. Something about its stillness felt deliberate, observant, almost official. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe coincidence. But it kept my attention longer than it should have. If the situation escalated into a legal dispute involving federal property, it wouldn't be unusual for someone to monitor the area discreetly. I made a mental note to record the license plate in the morning. By the time night fell completely, the air had turned cool and sharp. I stood at the window watching the patrol boat glow faintly under the porch lights, the violation tag still clinging stubbornly beside my laminated military orders. It looked like a symbol of two different worlds colliding, federal duty and neighborhood politics, and I was standing in the middle. I didn't know exactly what the HOA planned for the compliance sweep, but it was scheduled just days away, and if they actually attempted to tow the vessel, the consequences would explode far beyond our quiet little street. 2 days before the scheduled compliance sweep, the neighborhood felt different in a way that was hard to explain. The air was cooler, heavier, carrying a tension that seemed to settle over the rooftops like a thin fog. Even the usual morning sounds, the gulls, the distant ocean break, the hum of passing cars, felt muted. When I stepped outside to inspect the boat, the violation tag was still stuck to the hull, its orange color now slightly faded from sun exposure. My laminated orders fluttered lightly beside it, the plastic edges clicking softly against the metal each time the wind changed direction. I pulled out my phone and opened the base legal office email thread. My forwarded documents, photographs of the violation tag, and copies of the HOA letters were all attached in chronological order, exact evidence of the escalating overreach. Within minutes of sending an update, I received a reply from the legal officer. The message was short but serious. Continue documenting everything. Do not confront them directly. Interference with federal property is under active review. The tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a small misunderstanding anymore. It was an emerging investigation, and the military was now paying attention. I printed an additional set of documents, including the chain of command authorization and relevant federal statutes protecting military equipment from civilian interference. I placed them inside a clear folder and taped the copies near the stern of the boat, somewhere even more visible than the laminated orders. Anyone walking near my driveway could now see black and white proof that the vessel was untouchable by local regulation. Yet even as I taped the final sheet in place, I felt a quiet certainty that logic alone wouldn't stop Karen or the HOA board. Their mindset was rooted not in authority, but in control. That afternoon, while checking the security footage, I noticed something unsettling. At around 11:42 a.m., HOA Karen had walked toward the boat again. This time she wasn't holding just her clipboard. She carried a tape measure, a pen, and multiple sheets of paper covered with handwritten notes. She circled the boat, measured sections of the trailer, took photos, and wrote furiously. She wasn't documenting for understanding. She was building a case. She was determined to justify the violation, determined to prove the boat was in later that evening. I noticed lights flickering inside the HOA clubhouse through my window. Cars came and went, doors shut in hurried motions, silhouettes moved behind the blinds. It seemed the board was having an unscheduled meeting. The timing was suspicious, so close to the compliance sweep. My phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor I barely knew. "Hey, I think they're planning something big. Be careful." No details, no explanation. Just that warning. It made my pulse tighten. Whatever the HOA was planning, it wasn't going to be resolved with a conversation or an apology. Around 9 p.m., I checked the driveway again. Everything was still. The patrol boat reflected the porch light, creating a faint glimmer across the hull. The neighborhood, however, felt watchful. Behind curtains and from driveways, people observed quietly, uncertain whether to support me or the HOA. Fear of HOA retaliation kept most silent. I understood. They weren't military trained. They didn't know that federal property protection wasn't a political debate, it was law. Still, their silence created an invisible barrier between me and the community. The sense of isolation grew heavier with each passing moment. Just before midnight, a motion alert appeared on my phone. I opened the camera feed. The same dark SUV from earlier had returned, parking at the far end of the street. This time, the passenger side door opened slightly, and I saw the faint outline of someone adjusting something, possibly a camera or binoculars. They weren't part of the neighborhood. Their posture wasn't casual. They were observing, not visiting. And suddenly, I understood. The military had quietly sent someone to monitor the situation. Not to interfere, just to watch. To collect evidence of civilian overreach before stepping in formally. The next morning, I woke early and walked outside with a sense of anticipation. The ocean breeze was stronger, colder, sending ripples across the boat's cover. I checked the documents, the wiring, the hull, everything. While I worked, my phone buzzed with an email from the legal office. This time, the tone was even clearer. We may dispatch a liaison if interference continues. Document interactions. Do not remove the sticker. Let them act first. A strange mix of relief and anxiety washed over me. I wasn't alone in this anymore, but I also wasn't controlling the situation. I was simply positioned inside it. As the sun rose higher, a new HOA notice arrived, slipped under my door without knocking. It cited additional concerns, none of which applied to federal property. But the final line caught my attention. The towing company will be active on your street during the scheduled sweep. My pulse tightened again. That meant they were still planning to treat the patrol boat like an abandoned trailer or civilian vessel. The more they insisted on forcing their authority, the clearer it became that they had no understanding of the legal danger they were stepping into. That night, the streetlights flickered against the hull of the patrol boat, making the violation tag glow like a warning sign. I stood there in the quiet darkness, listening to the distant rumble of waves and the faint hum of the city beyond our neighborhood. I could feel the story shifting around me. Neighbors whispering, HOA documents circulating, officials watching, and a civilian committee pushing itself into a conflict it didn't understand. The compliance sweep was now only hours away, and one thing had become undeniable. The next step they took would determine whether this remained a neighborhood dispute or escalated into federal action. The morning of the scheduled compliance sweep arrived with an eerie stillness that was impossible to ignore. The neighborhood usually woke slowly, garage doors humming open, sprinklers clicking on, but today nothing moved. Even the ocean breeze felt hesitant, brushing lightly against the patrol boat as if waiting for something to unfold. I stood outside early, long before the HOA or the towing company would arrive. The hull looked cold and stern under the pale sunrise, the violation tag glowing faint orange. My laminated orders fluttered softly, almost like they were warning me that the day ahead wouldn't be ordinary. Around 7:40 a.m., I heard the distant growl of a diesel engine. The sound echoed down the street, bouncing between houses, growing louder with each turn. I checked the driveway camera feed. There it was. A tow truck, bright yellow, heavy-duty, the kind used for large RVs or broken buses. It crawled slowly toward my street, guided confidently by someone who believed they were about to perform a routine job. Behind it, another vehicle appeared, HOA Karen's car. She drove with a posture that radiated victory. In her mind, this was the moment she had been building toward since the first day she saw the boat. As the tow truck stopped in front of my driveway, the driver stepped out, gloves already on, clipboard ready, unaware of the storm he was walking into. Karen marched right beside him, pointing at the patrol boat with the eagerness of someone identifying a criminal. She tapped the orange violation tag with unnecessary emphasis, as if the sticker alone was enough to justify what they were about to do. I could see her talking rapidly, gesturing to the truck, explaining her version of authority. She didn't know the law, didn't want to know it, and certainly didn't intend to let it slow her down. Before I even approached them, something unexpected happened. From the end of the street, the black SUV I'd seen before rolled forward. It stopped quietly behind the tow truck, its presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The doors opened, and two individuals stepped out. Plain clothes, steady posture, government ID wallets clipped to their belts. The effect was instant. The air thickened. Karen's voice faltered mid-sentence. The tow truck driver froze with his strap halfway unhooked. These weren't neighbors, officers, or HOA volunteers. These were federal personnel, the kind who didn't raise their voice because their authority didn't need volume. They approached the patrol boat first, examining the hull, the markings, the violation tag, and the laminated orders with calm, deliberate movements. Their silence alone carried more authority than Karen's clipboard ever had. One of them turned toward me and simply said, "Thank you for documenting everything. We've been monitoring the escalation." His tone wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. They weren't here to argue or negotiate. They were here because the violation of federal property had crossed a line. And now, with witnesses, paperwork, and active interference, this wasn't a neighborhood issue. It was now their jurisdiction. Karen finally regained her voice, stepping forward with a defensive stiffness. "This vessel violates our HOA rules," she insisted, waving her clipboard like a shield. "We have the authority to remove it." The resident refused compliance. "This is necessary for community safety." The federal officer turned toward her slowly, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said, "you have interfered with an active federal asset. HOA policies do not supersede military authorization." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. Karen's confidence cracked visibly, her face shifting from irritation to confusion, and then to something very close to fear. The officer continued calmly, explaining that the violation tag, the threats of towing, and the mobilization of a private tow company constituted potential obstruction of federal operations. The tow truck driver's face drained of color. He stepped back instantly, raising both hands as if surrendering. I wasn't told," he stammered. "They just gave me the address." The officer nodded, acknowledging him but not blaming him. Karen, however, was not given the same leniency. The officers questioned her about her actions, her understanding of federal markings, and her decision to ignore multiple warnings. She offered excuses, but they collapsed under the weight of legal terminology she couldn't counter. Neighbors began to emerge quietly from their homes, curiosity pulling them toward the unfolding scene. Some pretended to check mail, others stepped out with coffee mugs. But their eyes were fixed on the confrontation. They watched the HOA president, usually the loudest voice of authority, stand speechless before federal agents. The dynamic of the entire street shifted in minutes. The illusion of HOA power, once so dominant, dissolved in the presence of actual authority. People witnessed what they always suspected but never saw proven. Federal law is not a suggestion, and neighborhood politics cannot overwrite it. The officers instructed Karen to step aside while they finished inspecting the vessel. They photographed the violation tag, the towing attempt, her clipboard notes, and even the tow truck itself. Every detail became evidence. Karen's hands shook as she folded her clipboard against her chest, no longer wielding it like a badge. The officers then approached me again, asking a few final verification questions about the timeline, the HOA letters, and my documentation. When we finished, one of them placed a protective notice on the hull, far more official than anything the HOA had ever issued. It confirmed federal oversight. Finally, the officers addressed the tow truck driver, dismissing him respectfully. Then they turned to Karen, informing her that a formal report would be filed and that further interference could trigger charges. The moment those words were spoken, the street felt lighter, as if the tension that had built for days finally broke. Karen walked away slowly, her head lowered, the weight of consequences settling onto her shoulders. The SUV pulled away moments later, leaving behind a silence that carried both relief and finality. And as I stood beside the patrol boat, one thing became unmistakably clear. The tide of this conflict had finally turned. The day after the federal officers intervened, the neighborhood felt almost unrecognizable. The tension that had hovered over the street for a week had dissolved into a hush of embarrassment and quiet observation. People walked slower, spoke softer, and glanced at my driveway with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The patrol boat now stood uncovered, its federal markings visible without obstruction, the violation tag removed and replaced by the official protective notice the officers had issued. The neighborhood had been forced into silence by the weight of reality, no longer shaped by HOA authority, but by the undeniable presence of federal law. By mid-morning, I received a formal email from the liaison office summarizing the incident. They thanked me for documenting everything, confirmed that a federal report had been filed, and assured me that the HOA had been instructed to cease all interference. The message was calm, precise, and professional, but it carried an undertone of severity. When the federal government puts something in writing, it's never casual. The violation wasn't treated as a harmless misunderstanding. It had been logged as a substantial breach. Reading the report felt strangely validating. For days, I had carried the burden alone. Now it was recognized officially. Later that afternoon, I saw Karen's car slowly pull into her driveway. She stepped out without her usual rigid posture or the clipboard she always clutched like a badge. There was no manufactured authority in her steps, no proclaiming voice echoing through the street. She looked smaller, almost like someone who had finally run into a boundary she couldn't push past. For the first time since the conflict began, she didn't lift her chin arrogantly when she walked. Instead, she avoided eye contact with every house she passed, especially mine. Power had shifted, and she felt it deeply. That evening, the HOA sent out a community-wide statement. They addressed the recent misunderstanding regarding military property, apologized for any unintended overreach, and announced an immediate revision of HOA procedures involving federal assets. The wording was diplomatically vague, but every neighbor who read it understood exactly what it meant. The HOA had been corrected, and publicly. The same board that had once tried to enforce its will on the entire neighborhood was now forced to acknowledge limitations. It was the kind of message that changed reputations instantly. And for the first time since moving here, the HOA sounded humble. Neighbors who had avoided speaking to me earlier now approached hesitantly. Some apologized for staying silent. Some admitted they were intimidated by the HOA and were afraid to get involved. Others simply wanted to express support. Their tone wasn't dramatic, just honest. Living under a strict HOA made people wary of standing out. They feared fines, letters, retaliation. And seeing their fear made me realize something. Karen's behavior wasn't just about me or my boat, it reflected a deeper problem in the community. People had become conditioned to accept authority without questioning its legitimacy. That night, as I inspected the patrol boat under the warm porch light, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. What began as a simple maintenance assignment had turned into a full confrontation between civilian entitlement and federal authority. The violation tag incident wasn't just disrespectful, it revealed how far someone could go when no one challenged them. It wasn't the sticker that mattered, but the mindset behind it. And now that mindset had been exposed, documented, and corrected. The hull felt cool beneath my hand, the metal still carrying the faint smell of ocean air mixed with sun-warmed steel. 2 days later, the HOA held an emergency election. Karen did not appear. Officially, she resigned for personal reasons, but the truth was clear to everyone. The board elected a new president, more reasonable, soft-spoken, someone who understood boundaries. The first change they implemented was a rule requiring HOA members to undergo compliance training, including education on federal and state laws. The second was a promise to review every complaint objectively instead of through personal bias. For the first time, people felt relief knowing they weren't at the mercy of one person's interpretation of power. When the maintenance period ended, I prepared the patrol boat for its return to the base. Backing the trailer into the street felt symbolic, like the vessel itself had become part of the neighborhood's history. A few neighbors stepped out to watch, giving small nods of respect. Not for me, but for what the boat represented: structure, law, boundaries, and a reminder that authority isn't claimed by noise or boldness, it's earned by responsibility. As I secured the final strap, a quiet stillness settled over the street, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and everything feels clearer. Driving the boat back to the base brought a sense of closure. The sun reflected off the hull, flashing in the side mirrors like a reminder of how